Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. Pakistan's economy has been faced with many difficulties and challenges. The current government is trying its utmost to steer the country out of this economic crisis, and it has also blamed the previous government of Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf led by Imran Khan over bringing the Pakistan's economic status to this particular level, and recent devastating floods also added to the difficulties of the country's economy. The government is doing its utmost, taking some difficult decisions also, but at the same time the value of rupee also touched record lows during the last year of 2022. And the government associated it with the speculators and smuggling. At the same time, the IMF ninth review, the release of $1.18 billion in the extended fund facility to Pakistan is also delayed. But the government and the authorities have expressed their resolve to complete the IMF program. And now what the government can do to deal with the speculators and smuggling to help appreciate the value of rupee against the greenback, and how crucial is the release of this IMF tranche in the immediate term to stabilize the country's economy, and how important and crucial is the collective wisdom of all the political stakeholders to steer the country out of this economic crisis. And the government has also often talked about the Charter of Economy. Can it provide a roadmap for the sustainable policy making and its implementation? And to look into the answers of these questions, we are honored to have been joined in the studio by Mr. Fahim Sardar. He's Senior Policy Specialist from Strategic Policy Planning Cell. Mr. Sardar, thank you very much for taking time out for Views on News. Really appreciate that. And on Skype, we are being joined by Ms. Ariba Shahid. She's a business journalist. Ms. Ariba Shahid, thank you very much for your time, also for being on Views on News. Now, let me begin the discussion with you, Mr. Sardar. So what major challenges do you think the government is faced with right now in order to steer the country out of this economic crisis?
Thank you. Firstly, there is a currency liquidity crunch, which basically is focused on the US dollar. Why? Because most of our trade is in US dollars. It's denominated in US dollars. If we had a broader spectrum of currencies, we would be facing a different situation. So right now, Pakistan, we've had improved tax collection. We have seen the resilience of the Pakistan economy. We have seen the remittances go down just a bit. We have seen the slowdown of certain aspects due to international demand. That is all one aspect, but when it comes to the currency crunch, that's how I like to define it. The currency crunch is basically that the world is basically getting its dollars sucked towards America because they're raising interest rates. That's happening at a time when we needed more currency inflows. Collectively, these 2-3 factors have caused a lot of issues. One of the issues is also the smuggling of dollars outside of Pakistan physically. So that needs to be curtailed. When we put all these 3 things together, we get the unfortunate result that we have in front of us.
So talking about the first aspect that you've just highlighted, that the dollar is being sucked back into the United States of America, the prime reasons for that?
The prime reason for that is that America has had a low interest rate policy for a very long time. That has basically given their stock markets, their money markets, an unprecedented boom for an extended period, which usually does not happen. That has also given rise to inflation. You see, we have to understand something, that America is the most sensitive about one thing. It's not about terrorism. It's not about nuclear weapons. They are most sensitive about inflation. And for that, they will do anything to bring down inflation, because it's such a huge country. They cannot afford to have inflation rising. So what they're doing is they're raising interest rates. Interest rates are, I think, just above 5% right now, if I'm not mistaken, and the US Federal Reserve has jacked it up very aggressively. It's going to jack it up even further, although there are indications that their inflation has started to ease up. Having said that, America is doing that to basically cool down its markets and to reset some of their markets, so to speak. I personally think that they're basically ready for some kind of a conflict, for which they're creating a value buffer. in their own society. That's a separate debate. I won't get into that right now. But one of the major points is that when they're raising interest rates, the housing market has come under severe stress. Why? Because their markets are primarily dependent on credit and exotic products, and all of them are basically dependent on liquidity. So when liquidity is going down, everything starts to squeeze up. According to my estimates, roundabout prices in many of the U.S. states, house prices have gone down by 30%.
So the depreciation of the value of the rupee is not exclusive. That's what you mean to say. It's with the other currencies of the world.
It's not, because when you look at the euro to dollar parity, it's literally at parity, par, almost. Okay. When you look at how it has been doing against other currencies, the dollars are being sucked out. So it's just a simple demand supply.
So that comes in the international perspective. So specifically talking about the depreciation of value of rupee. So what reasons do you associate with that? So there is a 21% of high depreciation of the rupee against the dollar. And in August, the differential was 28%.
Sure. The rupee, when we speak specifically of the rupee, what's happened is that exports have slowed down, and we've had a dip in remittances. And our remittance scheme, which was a dollar denominated, the state bank scheme, I'm sorry, I've just forgotten the name for some reason, that there's been a dip in that as well. So when you put together these elements, there is a decrease in supply. Having said that, our dollars are being smuggled. The dollars that are in Pakistan are being physically smuggled into other countries, the Middle East countries, to Afghanistan and perhaps some other places. Thirdly, there are some restrictions on how much you can sell without being tagged for the CNIC. The FATF clearly says that you can sell. You need a CNIC identification at $15,000 when you liquidate $15,000 in a Pakistani market. The State Bank of Pakistan, I believe, is doing it at $1. So there is like a huge problem.
Right. Let me bring highly looking forward to, and the government has expressed resolve regarding this particular, the completion of the IMF program, but the 9th review regarding the release of financial $1.18 billion is still delayed. So how crucial do you think it is in the immediate term in order to give stability to the economy in the country, and what the government needs to do in order to secure it?
Right now, Pakistan is dollar thirsty, so any kind of inflow will be a welcome sign. I mean, I personally think that we need much more than this, but that's a separate debate. But if the IMF tranche comes in, it will be helpful. It's not going to resolve the problem. The problems that we're facing will be resolved permanently and conclusively when we focus again on generation of value. When we start focusing on things like increasing remittances, increasing exports, and I'll come to exports again. When we start focusing on plugging the hemorrhage that our country is facing. So when we talk about exports, we should understand that our capacity to export is not at where we are right now. It's much more than this. People talk about exportable surplus and so on and so forth. That's fine, but we have to be able to sell whatever we can in whatever currency that is necessary so that we can at least generate more foreign exchange. Right now, I'm not seeing any let up in the dollar requirement. So if the IMF gives the tranche and if the review is successful, then of course it's going to be helpful, but it's not going to be a permanent solution. Once again, just to repeat myself, the permanent solution lies in the generation of value through the assets that we already have.
So we'll be talking about how to increase the generation of value. That requires, of course, increasing the production capacity and increasing the industrial base, if I'm correct on that front.
Well, yes and no. I mean, what you're saying right now is for the medium to long term, and we're talking about a quantum leap. We're not talking about that right now.
Right.
All I'm saying is that with our existing infrastructure.
So what those particular specific sectors could you identify in order to increase the export on that?
One is food, pharmaceuticals, IT, And we had seen a considerable, a very encouraging level of growth in these sectors. When we talk about IT, our IT had really actually started to take a...
The Prime Minister recently has emphasized on increasing the IT exports also. But the current volume remains to be around $2 billion. So how it could be enhanced? There is an estimated benchmark that Prime Minister alluded to, that is $5 billion annually. How it could be brought from $2 to $5 billion?
$5 billion has been quoted many times, and rightly so, because that is something that we should keep as a floor, not even as a ceiling. So how do we do that? We basically do that through whatever operational things that are needed for IT companies to perform. We need to fulfill that. There are bottlenecks, there are issues, there are limitations, there are remittance issues. The Russian digital account was being linked to the IT system. We have to check if that's been done or not. Even if it has been done, I know for a fact that many IT people, IT companies are keeping their money abroad. Having said that, now let's shift to many of our major exporters who are given subsidies. They are parking their dollars abroad. Now, these are temporary phenomena unless we sort of encourage them and we make sure that those dollars come to Pakistan, especially if somebody or some segment has received subsidies. Our major sectors which can really yield a lot of very quick results are IT, pharmaceuticals, even textiles, I will say, because we do have an end-to-end development.
So in the immediate term, when you also mention that we can increase the exports through food and textiles also, after in the aftermath of the recent devastating floods, don't you think this particular area happens to be a constraint for Pakistan because the crops have been badly hit in the larger portion, especially when we talk about Sindh? And then we talk about the cotton crop also had a severe impact because of the recent floods.
There's an absolute issue, very rightly said by you. We would only be exporting what we can export. What we need domestically, we're not supposed to export it. But we have to bear one thing in mind, and this, whether we have floods or not, the World Bank has said that we have a wheat production capacity of 89 million tons, and we're stuck at 27. So that just itself is a reflection of where we should be standing. Let's not call it, let's not look at the high estimate that an organization has given. Let's take a middle view. Let's talk about 50 million. But we have to focus on, we have to bear one thing in mind when we talk about crops. Many crops, high yielding crops, only need 4 months to grow. So that's a 4-month cycle that we can sort of work on. We import ginger, we import garlic. These things can be grown in a few months. It does not take years.
Right. We are joined by another participant on the phone line by Dr. Niaz Murtaza. He's political economist. Dr. Murtaza, thank you very much for taking time out for also the energy sector. Now, how do you think, what basically irks the IMF the most? Is it the blanketed subsidies or targeted subsidies?
I think both. Because the IMF is trying to make sure that the coffers of the government are full. And the IMF, let's face one fact, the IMF is in no position to give anybody, any country, in any circumstance, any leeway, because the IMF will go bankrupt. We have to understand that. The IMF is a lender to more than 150 countries. Can you imagine if 100 countries start saying you give us a 10% rebate? The IMF will be bankrupt, and this has happened not once but many times in the past 30 years. That when a country defaults, the whole system starts to collapse. There's a domino effect. I won't get into that. Right now, the IMF is very particular about any kind of expense that the government is doing. So what the IMF is trying to do, rightly or wrongly, is to bring down the expenses and to push up the revenue so that there is a positive gap. A larger positive gap which can allow you to absorb the shocks of today and tomorrow. The IMF is going to obviously focus on, and I have to be very cold here, on how the government can generate revenue. The government generates revenue through taxes, through basically any kind of inflow, and of course from non-tax revenues. In all circumstances, the government will be exercising its power to get more from the whatever regulatee is. At the end of the day, the IMF is like, if you can generate more revenue from some other source, do it.
So what about the fuel import bill? It happens to be a larger chunk of the overall expenditure. So the government has been talking about looking for new avenues and also the idea of shifting to the renewables. How important that one is? So would it really considerably reduce the import bill or our dependency on the imported fuel?
Reducing our dependence on something that we've been doing for almost 70 years is going to, you have to do it on a war footing basis, and it has to be done through a plan. Let's take it one by one. I'll try to be quick. When we talk about crude oil, we're basically importing crude oil from the Middle East, from OPEC countries, and Saudi Arabia in particular. So moving away from that source, because Saudi Arabia is following the OPEC prices. And of course, when the price went up to $100, we've experienced that before, but at that time the rupee was close to 70 per dollar. So there is a huge differential that we faced, and as per the economic survey, we had to pay $4 billion additional to buy oil. So that was because we depreciated the rupee, and then we allowed ourselves to sort of free float the rupee, which I have a serious objection to. When we try to shift to another source, or when we try to shift to renewables, that is extremely important, but that requires a lot of planning, and it requires a lot of how shall I say, careful execution, because every minute that you spend on another source is going to cost money, and you're investing in another source to save the overall larger quantum.
So what about finding other avenues for the crude oil import?
Yeah, there is another avenue. There is another avenue. I've worked on it. You can generate, you can create crude oil from dirty water, and Brazil is the leading country in this.
That's a very interesting.
Yes, I've actually proposed a project on this. So it's not like, and it's not very complicated.
How is it done?
What happens is you take used water, and you have to allow it to stagnate. And then you have to let algae come on top of it, then you have to give it carbon dioxide. I'm not a biochemist, so I'm not an expert. But what happens is the algae starts to turn black. You have to put that black algae through a biorefinery, and guess what comes out? Two products. One is crude oil, bio-crude oil, and the second is a hard substance which is rich in nutrients, which is used as a fertilizer. So Brazil is at the top of this, and this I've taken up this project myself, trying to push it. What I'm trying to say, there's always an alternative, but you have to have a plan, and then you have to execute it absolutely mercilessly and without delay.
Right. To avoid politicizing economy, and how Charter of Economy can help bring in the political consensus on that front.
For the past 8 years, I've been saying that the economy and politics need to have a divorce, and they need to go their separate ways and need to stop talking to each other, which is not possible. But if you look at the economies of Italy, Japan, they are always every time summer sets into Italy, a new government comes in. But the economy keeps moving for 2-3 reasons. Number one, because they've enshrined in their bureaucracy and in their economic systems a mechanism that things, policies, issues, recommendations, implementation keeps moving. So if there's a political issue, it always has a cascading effect. It always has a radiating effect onto the economy, which is fine. But when we have them completely fused together, that's where the problem starts. Same thing happens. What happens in Italy happens in Japan as well. They have so many, every, I think, year and a half, they have a new government. But that just doesn't seem to bother their economy. So we need to sort of craft a system which is perhaps the Charter of Economy. The Charter of Economy is just to very quickly touch upon that. It has to be done in stages, time-wise and topic-wise. The first stage I would call is the most crucial, because that's where all people who are looking in different directions have to agree to some very basic things. And the first point, I'll just leave food for thought for everyone, is violence. and disruptions. You cannot allow violence and destructions to happen in economic areas. Everybody has to agree to that. Everybody's a winner from that. So what you do is you basically bring up these aspects which are acceptable to everybody, whether they like it or not. You just stick to that only in the short period. Then you decide on more sophisticated things and far more, let's just say, intricate things. And then you move on to the long term, where you have a long-term view about the economy. Pakistan needs that extremely importantly right now. Pakistan has to have some kind of an understanding internally, where the economy does not stop, where the economy does not falter. Politics has to be, as you said, the politicization of the economy has to be reduced. And just before we started, I mentioned to you that people are talking about the economy with absolutely unfettered in an unfettered manner. It's not meant to be discussed by everyone. People should talk about it, but when it comes to giving public statements, well, we should sort of just be a little more positive about things.
Right. So what I understand from your view, Mr. Sadar, is that Charter of Economy is the term that is alternative to the continuity of policies. Am I correct on that
Yes.
front? That is often had been discussed by Planning Minister Hassan Iqbal as well.
Yes. Continuity of policies is extremely important. We take the example of, let's look at Italy. Any investor who invests in Italy knows for the next 7 years, they know pretty much what's going to happen. So when our policies keep changing even in the same regime, so that sort of creates problems for ourselves. So what we can do is we can have a slightly longer term view, and we can basically bring in all the stakeholders so that their discussion is taken care of at the inception instead of at an advanced stage.
Right. Dr. Murtaza, when we talk about Charter of Economy, do you also